Hey everyone, Wolf Lord Rho here. Before I begin today, a big thank you to Ahmed for the virtual gift voucher. Huge thank you my friend for the support, I really appreciate it, thank you. Apologies if my voice breaks or sounds a little off today, I'm a little bunged up with a cold. But on to today. Today we're taking a look as the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, the Cadians, encounter the sons of the Night Haunter himself, the Night Lords. And for this discussion we are going old school, back to 1996, some 24 years ago, to the second edition of Warhammer 40k and the Chaos Codex. Now I don't think we need a 24-year-old spoiler warning, but I will say you absolutely cannot go wrong diving into some old school codexes. The character of the models, the beginnings of the lore, and some great small fluff stories like this one really can't be beaten. So dust off your old books or codexes and dive into some old school awesomeness. But with that said, let's just jump straight in. Now this particular story is titled The Battle for Purgatory, and it takes place on a world of said name. Purgatory, having been recently reclaimed by the Imperium, has seen the arrival of a small force of Cadians to support and reinforce the new and inexperienced local militia, the beginnings of the local defence force. Stationed at the world's only spaceport, the Cadians have undertaken routine patrols out into the surrounding wilderness. A rough, rugged landscape of vast forest and rising mountain ranges, all covered in ice and snow. Purgatory was a cold and bleak world at the best of times. Sergeant Cern turned his gaze away from the monotony of the landscape for a moment and glanced at the ragtag collection of men that made up the patrol. They were mainly the part-time members of the militia who worked in Purgatory's mines when not on their tour of duty. The poorly armed, and even more poorly armoured Purgatorians did not come up to the Cadian sergeant's standards for soldiery. Not by a long way. They were all either scrawny and unhealthy specimens or overweight and already past their prime. The worst threat they had ever had to face up to was an enraged tribe of indigenous primitive humanoids. Apart from himself, the only other guardsmen among the party were Krates and Dolst, both seasoned fighters who had served under him on several campaigns. Each of them had seen their share of death, and yet here, on this blighted world, without having been involved in proper armed conflict for over a year, the troopers felt an almost perverse thrill at the possibility of invaders having landed on Purgatory. The endless waiting and sentry duties had begun to make them all feel uneasy, afraid that they might be losing the edge to their finely honed skills. Training and target practice were no substitute for the brutal learning experience of war. Nothing honed a soldier's reflexes like the adrenaline-charged moment in the thick of battle when you charged an orc bunker or stood up to a slavering tyrannid horde. You either learned, and learned fast, or you didn't see another sunrise to make the same mistake again. This is quite an interesting situation here. 3 veteran Cadians taking out the local militia on patrols, using their expertise and experience to try and teach the locals. And firstly, it's great to see the Imperial Guard, or Astra Militarum, be shown a little respect, to actually show that there's more to them than just the cannon fodder we so often see, that these guys are skilled and brave soldiers. Sure, they're not gene-enhanced space marines, they're just like me or you, but then doesn't that make them the real heroes? It's actually a situation that's very similar to real life, where soldiers are used to train and improve local forces. So having the Cadians perform this type of role makes a lot of sense. But as ever within the Imperium, peace is always only temporary, and it's not long before reports are received of attacks on outposts across the world. The enemy said to be clad in archaic power armour. And this news is enough to send most of the population into mass panic. And considering we know it's Night Lords, it's a fair bet to say it's more than just word of mouth spreading the fear. The Cadians, however, are defiant, and if anything, eager to face the enemy. They don't have to wait long. An explosion racks the patrol as a militiaman is sent flying. The Cadians immediately scan their surroundings as the local militia freeze in panic. Where moments before there was nothing, now there stands huge dark armoured warriors, striding out of the gloom. With Cern's order given, the three Cadians immediately drop to the ground and begin firing, the militia slowly beginning to follow suit. At first, the sergeant thinks the figures of Space Marines could be Dark Angels, or even Death Company Blood Angels. But as their advance continues, he realises them for what and who they are. Curling horns and cruel spikes adorned the warriors' helmets and ceramite shoulder pads. However, some of the attackers' suits seemed less flexible in their design. Constructed from riveted plasteel plates, images of death and chaos emblems covered the pitted and age-corroded power armour, while dead human eyes stared out from withered heads hung on chains from the Marines' belts. The winged skull crests marked these particular individuals as Night Lords, the foul progeny of the Night Haunter himself. The Cadians' homeworld was the first line of defence for the Imperium against the tide of chaos which flowed from the Eye of Terror. The Imperial Guardsmen recruited from Cadia were all too familiar with Chaos Space Marines. Mankind's representatives on Purgatory, however, had so far remained free from the attentions of the minions of Chaos, isolated and cut off as the planet had been for so many millennia. Cern swallowed hard. The sudden emergence of the Night Lords from the seemingly featureless landscape suggested a knowledge of infiltration and deployment built up over numerous conflicts. That, and the loose formation in which they now approached, screamed a warning through the sergeant's consciousness. These were not ordinary Chaos Space Marines. These were hard-bitten veterans from the time of the Horus Heresy itself. Being a Cadian, Sergeant Cern has faced the disciples of the ruinous powers before. But then, he was within the full might of the Imperial Guard. Here, he is just two men, and a handful of scared witless militia, who barely know what end of the gun to point at the enemy. He knows their chances of surviving this encounter are slim, to say the least. The local militia weren't even equipped with basic las guns. The shots they fired had no hope of penetrating power armour. Scrambling for his radio, Sergeant Cern attempts to call for support, only for a haywire grenade to fry his equipment. Followed a second later by guardsman crates being burnt alive by a melter gun. With hope of reinforcement lost and no chance of escape, Cern raises his bolt pistol. Squeezing the trigger, he fired off several shots directly at the Marine's helmet. Over the sound of gunfire from both sides, Cern thought he heard a roar of pain, and he saw the target jerk backwards. Regaining his balance, the veteran raised his head, and the Cadian saw the shattered stump of a demonic horn. Cern watched as the Chaos Space Marine raised an ornate bolter to fire, and then, inexplicably, found himself thrown to the ground on the other side of the ridge. It took several seconds for his nervous system to register what had happened. The first thing that told him something was wrong was the sight of his right arm laying several meters away. Then, suddenly, sickening awareness flooded his consciousness as he felt hot blood pumping from the ragged stump of his shoulder. Pain engulfed him in a cold wave, and he felt his stomach heave. And with the loss of their commander, the men of the militia break. Some flee in outright terror, others throwing down their weapons and surrender. They all die regardless, as the Night Lords gun them all down. A second group of Night Lords appearing behind the Imperial patrol. It had been hopeless from the very beginning. But CERN, somehow, whether through sheer determination, the adrenaline coursing through his body, or simple faith in the Emperor, has refused to die. And as the Night Lord reaches the ridge, CERN crawls desperately towards his severed arm that still clutches his bolt pistol, his bloodied fingers frantically pawing at the weapon as the Night Lord closes the gap, a laugh emanating from the remains of his helm as he ends the sergeant for good. This was the point of the Long War. It was not to wage some galaxy-spanning bloody crusade for the Dark Gods, like those feeble-minded berserkers loyal to the Blood God, but to kill and revel in the killing. But this was only the beginning. The Night Lords had not finished with this pathetic world, and once they were done, not a single soul would remain alive. Those who resisted their will, or those who were not fit for the slave labour camps, would die. And the Night Lords would relish their dying. Soon this inhospitable world would seem to its inhabitants to have been a paradise, as they learnt the horrors of the warp. Hell had come to purgatory. Ah man, I just love these small pieces of fluff. Just the magic and mystique that they bring. It fired my imagination back then as a kid, and it still does today. The Cadians, though hopelessly outmatched, still come across like absolute studs, even though they're just getting obliterated in seconds. And like I said, it's a nice change of pace to the usual portrayal, in what is essentially a Night Lord showpiece. Though they know it's hopeless, they still fight. The Cadians still come across like brave, courageous heroes. The sheer guts of Sergeant CERN having lost his arm, still desperately crawling for his weapon, refusing to give up. You know, you're used to that kind of bravado from the Catachans, but like I said, it was refreshing to see it for the Cadians too. The contrast of their demeanour compared to the local militia. Like I said, yes, they get wrecked, but they do not hesitate even for a second. And the coming of the Night Lords, what more could you expect? Arriving without warning and destroying the Imperial patrol without a chance. It's safe to say the world of Purgatory has only just seen the beginning. And for a short fluff piece that barely measured a page and a half, it really did a great job of showing the characters, highlighting the best of both, the grit and determination against the odds of the Cadians, and the fear-inspiring terror of the Night Lords. I really hope we get more of a showing of these old school fluff pieces in the new codexes to come, because they definitely seem to have diminished over the past few years. But like I said, back as a kid there was nothing better at stoking the imagination and really helping you see the spirit of the models in the codex, embracing the character of the army. But I guess only time will tell. But as always guys, what do you think? Do you think the Cadians usually come off on the short end of the stick, especially compared to the Catachans? And do you think they stood a chance against the Night Lords? As always, drop your thoughts in the comments below, I love to read them. A huge thank you to all my subscribers, your support really means a lot to me, it truly does. And if you're new, please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. And if you enjoyed this particular vid, then why not drop a like on it too. But with that said, I am off, and I'll see you all again real soon.